Hello, everyone. This is your favorite voice of business psychology, armed with research, personal experiences, and a passion to understand the nuances of rapidly evolving workplace dynamics. I am your host, Kritika Kashyap, a management psychologist. Join me in today's episode as I converse with Kiran, a seasoned HR professional who discovered her passion for human resources by accident while studying at King's College London. With a career spanning over a decade, Kiran has worked in people centric roles for some of the globe's largest employers. Fondly known as the HR nerd, she offers a deep well of expertise. Our candid discussion centers on psychological contract between employees and employers, focusing on the shifting expectation one might have when joining an organization. We explore how these expectations evolve with the changing in industries, life stages, and also evolving landscape of the modern workplace. Good morning, Kiran. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast Psych and Success, the Gen Z edition.
Very early good morning to you too, Kritika. Thank you for having me.
When I always wanted you to be on the podcast because the when we met, we I connected you through LinkedIn, and that is when we started having a conversation. And when we met for the first time, I was so first of all, I was really, really grateful that you actually came to help me out, understand about the whole HR world and everything. And the kind of passion that came through your work and your excitement about telling me how the HR world works and about your experiences was so good for me that I just wanted to you to be on the show.
No, thank you. Thank you for saying that. I don't know if it's publicly correct to say out loud that I'm an HR nerd, but I'm a huge HR nerd. So I'm always happy to talk about HRE stuff.
Okay, that's amazing. And so, why don't you start with telling our listeners about a bit about yourself, your experience, your journey?
So I sort of fell into HR. It wasn't something I wanted to be when I was 3 years old.
Oh,
And I,
okay.
I don't think there
Did
are
you
many
even
people
know
out there.
HR? Did you even know HR existed when you were three
It
years
did.
old?
It did. It did. So,
Yeah.
from what I recall now, and memory is funny business, is that I wanted to go for my master's abroad. And there were just three
Okay.
possible things that I thought I could do. I could either do international relations or economics, or I could go into HR. And at that point in time, I really just wanted to be at a great university in London. The discipline at that
Okay.
point didn't matter to me as much. I was like, either of these three things I can make a career out of.
Right.
So that's how I got into HR. I went and I studied HR and organization analysis at King's College London. Great here,
Okay.
great place. And then I came back home to Pakistan. I'm an only child,
Yeah.
so I was keen to be close to my parents. I came back
Of
home.
course.
And then within a few months, I joined the management training program in Nestle, Pakistan. That's where I'm originally from.
Oh, okay. Because Nestle is quite popular for its HR department, isn't it?
It is. I can say this now. I didn't know this at the time of joining it, but when it
Okay.
comes to HR, I would say companies that are, FMCGs like Nestle, Pepsi, Coke, they're HR institutions because they've been doing this for such a long time. So even when you look at
Right.
performance management for them or talent management for them or recruitment, they're probably trying out their 150th frameworks right now, right? So I do
Wow.
consider Nestle a great HR university. So that's where I started. I stayed with Nestle for some 4 years.
Okay.
And I always think that I joined thinking, yeah, let's just work in HR. But there was this one particular leader that I started working for. His name was Shehzad Umar. And he was just fantastic. I think working with him made me realize how HR works. It could be strategic. And even though strategic is a funny word to use these days because I feel like it's
Right.
overused, but just the
Yeah.
idea that different things in HR are connected to each other And if you could really do something right and create a difference in an employee's life cycle with the organization, that's something really powerful. And I think that's not
Of
what a
course.
lot of us end up doing in HR sometimes. So I feel like that's the role that I did with him in terms of performance improvement. At that time, it was called Nestle Continuous Excellence. So it's a role where you
Okay.
sort of look at implementing some lean and agile principles into HR, right? Which means how do you cascade your goals, what HR KPIs you make, how do you problem solve. So it was like a crash course in HR generalist information for me. I really enjoyed that. And I think that's where my passion
Okay.
for working in the field started. I think it gave me
Ah, right.
sort of like the attachment to HR, the ability to see end to end, which I didn't have before. So that role and Shahzad Umar, I always say, are two people who made my career, like two things that have made my career. So from there,
Wow.
I got married. We shifted to Dubai. I joined Emirates Airline. So I joined them as a functional trainer, and I sort of
Okay.
crossed over, did some leadership training with them, then a performance improvement role with them again. I took a few months sabbatical because my mom was not doing well. I had my first
Okay.
child while I was working with them as well. Went back, joined them back in. And around COVID time, I remember during COVID time, I decided to leave Emirates because I felt I wasn't doing what I needed to do with my career and my role. I felt I had over specialized into a stream and I was more interested in doing a wider scope. So that's where I went
Okay.
into DP World. I did a consultant role with them for a few months with a lovely lady called Rosanna Patron. And then I joined Amazon. And then once
Right.
the layoffs in Amazon happened, I was a large part of my team was let go of, as it happens in Meta, Bank, all these places.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It was
So
huge.
it was massive, and I think it was also a little bit strangely done. I would say, like, there's no
Okay.
reason to know what teams were let go of or how, but I
Okay.
think that's the reality of the job market these days, right? And that's how I've ended up back at DP World now, because I had a great time working here and I knew some really good people who were able to make sure that I could continue the conversation with them.
I think that was really fortunate that you found your passion in HR and you've had quite a diverse experience in the HR industry as well. So, what do you think has been your favorite, most thing, and the least favorite thing about working in the HR?
I think my least favorite thing has been that we sometimes do things for the sake of doing things. Like, we sometimes launch new frameworks for the sake of launching new frameworks because there's
Okay.
a VP or a CEO or someone somewhere out there who's gotten attached to a new thing they've heard about. We end up wasting a lot of company money sometimes when we don't think through the implementation of certain things. That's one. My most favorite thing about HR is, and this is interesting because to me, I thrive on connection. So I'm an introvert, but I love the idea
Doesn't
of,
seem so to me at all.
you know, I'm an introvert who's a great actor. Or maybe I was
Okay, we'll take
initially
that.
an introvert and I'm not an introvert anymore. But I love the idea
Right.
of being able to connect dots for somebody else, right? I feel that when employees join a company, there's so many things going on. You're doing your actual job. And then there's all of this business going on around how development takes place, how promotions take place, how a career grows, really, right? And I think that HR advocacy part, where you become an
Yeah.
advocate for the employee and for the business, which is a sweet spot that we don't end up realizing, very often in HR. The idea to be able
Okay.
to hold space for somebody and help them is my favorite part about HR. I think as HR professionals, we're there to create value for the business, but we should ideally also have the skills to hold space for employees. Yes, not all employee requests or aspirations can be met, but we can still create and hold that space where we encourage these conversations. And I think that's what I really like about the job.
So, listening to you, I feel like you're bent over towards a people skill and really helping people to be the best version of themselves. So, do you think is it something that that people already have who should come in the HR industry, or people can grow on that? Like with time, they can. Or is it because, you, of course, you need to have the passion towards people to really be there for them and be an advocate for them, as you said?
Good question, that. Because I've often wondered about that. I think traditionally, when you're asked to write a cover letter as a new joiner, right? It's when you're starting out your career in HR, people end up starting it with, I'm a great people person. I love people, right? So I think that's where the question is coming from. I don't think you need to be a people person at all to be in HR. Yeah, it's an added perk because
Okay.
you'll be able to connect with people more, I would say, more easily. But I think at the end of the day, a job is a job. So as long as
Yeah.
you recognize that your job as an HR professional is to sort of, find that balance between being a coach, to being a partner, to being a consultant, to being an implementer. If you consider it a part of your job, then you'll pick up that skill very easily. I don't consider it as something
Right.
that people just are born with, right? And I think that shouldn't be a limitation. So, for example, I'll speak of this in terms of leadership, right? That
Okay.
I've been involved with leadership training in different organizations, and I'm also I've done my own coaching training and stuff. So I I'm at a point where I feel that some people are born with a drive to help others. So these are people you'll naturally see, these leaders sponsoring careers, thinking about people's performance, driving them hard, saying, you're not doing this right, go back. Like they're invested in making sure that somebody else's career also takes off, right? And these are leaders I've seen across different organizations. So now I've been in many
Okay.
organizations. Some of them have had mature people practices, other have been on, the start of that journey. But those people who have this in themselves are always there because they don't need a framework to tell them that, they should be sponsoring careers this way, they should be developing talent this way.
Yeah.
So that is there. But what I also see that if an organization is able to put down firm processes and systems around saying, no, we do want our leaders to develop people, then it's something you have to build up as a skill, right? That at one of my
Right.
organizations, for example, when we reviewed talent, we also used to look at a manager's engagement scores for their team, right? A
Okay.
manager's feedback on their leadership skills from other people. And what that does is that converts that piece about being a people person or sponsoring people into a skill instead of just a conversation saying that, oh, you're such a good person, you're developing your team. So it's a
Yeah.
concrete skill that's reviewed then. And I think when you present
Okay.
it to people like that, and even if you talk to me and you ask me that, Kiran, I think this is a skill you're missing, I'm able
Right.
to develop it, to
Work on it.
consciously look at what can be done. But when you say, Kiran, you know what, you're not just naturally, you're not a nice person who thinks of others.
Yeah,
I don't
that's
know what
very
to do
vague. I mean,
with that
that's not
career.
even a critical feedback. I would ask you about, because you have had such an extensive, almost, I believe it's a decade of experience that you've had already,
Yeah, 13
isn't it?
plus years now. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. So quite an extensive
No.
experience. So, how have you seen the organization culture and then evolving throughout the decade? And since you have not just been a part of different companies, but you have also changed the whole region for yourself. So, how have you seen that transitioning, the organization cultures transitioning?
Um, it's a huge question. So I think one thing that's remained consistent for organizations is profitability.
Of course.
And what's changed is also perhaps this, that even the giants are struggling to be profitable now. Right, that's one. So the way the industry has changed is that, and the stock market as well, in a way, I would say, is that the
Yeah.
companies who were at the top are now in a fiercer run to maintain that monopoly of sorts, right? So I think that's how the industry has widely changed. Tech industry has come up so strongly the way it
Yeah.
was never before. So whatever
Of course.
happens within organizations, I think is always changed or shaped by what's happening externally in the industry and the society, right? So
Of course.
with the rise of the FANG organizations are typically, I would say that they're less tenured. So you would see people coming in and out quite often. Because they're private
Right.
listed as well. There's a lot of stock market waves like that you have to ride. So it means these are not traditional organizations where most of the population stays on for a very long period of time. So what that does is that creates a lot of mobility in the market over a 10-year period, for
Right.
example, right? So the way
Right.
that has shaped the rest of the organizations is also that people stay at organizations for a lesser period of time. And I remember papers were being written on this when I was graduating from my MSc at King's, on just this,
Okay.
that perhaps the 20 to 30-year career has seen its death now, right? And that is very,
Ah.
very true. People are staying on in organizations for much smaller tenures than they did before.
Okay.
So that's one point. I think the other way in which things have changed is that based on what's becoming socially acceptable in terms of our politics, our policies around equity, inclusion, etc., these things now have a greater place. The conversation now has a greater place in organizations. So I think that's another thing that's changed. And the third thing that's changed is, that thing we always talk about, multi-generational workforce, Gen X, Gen Z, all of these things in the workplace. While I
Yeah.
don't primarily think of resources or people that way, I think what that
Okay.
generational talk has done and what technology has done is it's made us more aware of the opportunities around us and also
Okay.
of what well-being means to us as employees. So I feel employees are better informed or have more resources to be informed about their rights, about how their organizations are doing, about what could be the possible opportunities out there. So I think these are the three kind of things that have changed in a larger scheme of things.
So have you also seen and is it just in the FANG industry that you have seen that the tenure employee tenure has lessened, or is it an overall thing? And as you say that 20,
Yeah.
30 years is no more a thing being in the
Yeah.
organization, is it with millennials coming in and Gen Z coming in, especially in the picture, has it been because of the generation, and is it industry specific as well?
Yeah. So I think some of it is industry specific, and also region specific. I think
Okay.
tech industry is more volatile when it comes to
Yeah.
hiring and firing, right? That's always there. The second thing is also region specific. Some regions are more mature in terms of employment practices. They have more legal implications or legal filters in place to make sure that the employees are protected and those kind of things. So
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
people in those societies end up having longer tenures because they earn greater benefits and all of those
Yeah.
things. And then there's some welfare societies where your pensions and these things are linked to your tenures at work as well. So you'd see that, for example, Emiratis end up staying longer at organizations because their welfare or benefit packages are calculated in such a way that it's better to stay on and grow that instead of hop, hop, hop. Right. So that's
Right.
another point. So I think it depends really on what region you're in, what industry you're in. But yes, one thing that has happened, and I wouldn't say that Gen Z have come in and made everybody realize that everybody can have matcha and like work from home. I don't think that's
Right.
happened.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think more than we all experience the world in the same way. So, the wave of technology, awareness of well-being and resilience, but we take it in or we use that information or action on it differently based on where we are in terms of our circumstances in life. So if I'm somebody who's planning to retire in the next 5 years and I feel like I
Yeah.
haven't met my financial goal, perhaps I'll be more pushed to go and look in another
Of course.
organization if my own organization is not offering me that, right? Then of
Yeah.
course
Makes
you
sense.
double that up with the idea that am I working in a place where I hold a passport or am I an expat? So I think more than generational differences, I think it's contextual differences, where you are, what society you're in, what industry you're in, what part of your life you're in that specific point in time. I think those things are different, because what I've seen happen at work is that we do make a big fuss about different generations coming to work
Yeah.
at work, but
Right. Yeah.
but people tend to generally keep up with the shift in population. So we've always had multi-generational stuff, right? It's any employee
Of course.
population that you pick in, we've had yearly management trainee programs, we've had yearly retirements, we've had yearly people leave and come
Yeah, of
in for
course. I
lateral
mean,
moves.
every set period of time would have at least three generation of workforce working
Working together, yeah.
in organizations. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think generations find a balance in terms of what are the new engagement rules. Because I feel as the society changes, as economies change, like post COVID, for example, our
Yeah.
psychological contract has completely changed with our organizations, right? I remember
Yeah.
before, and I'll explain a little bit about what psychological contract is.
Yes, of course.
So I came across this concept when I was doing my thesis in university. I did my thesis on this. Psychological contract is the unwritten, unsaid contract in your mind, which is based on your expectations from the company and their expectations from you when you join a company, right?
So, just for the listeners, what sort of expectations which are unwritten can there be from the organization standpoint and also
Yeah.
from the employee standpoint? If you can give a couple of examples.
Yeah. So our expectations from a workplace are shaped by different factors, right? If you're somebody who's just graduated, your expectations
Correct.
from a workplace are shaped by your academic institutions because they tell you these two, three big companies will come, they'll pick you up. And if they pick you up like a consultancy, one of the big four picks you up, your career is
Yeah.
made. It'll be accelerated, you'll be traveling. So a lot of that glam we associate with it, right? That how
Yeah.
if we do well and if we work hard, we're picked, we're special, we'll be taken care of. I
Right.
think that's set up by academic institutes. I think
Okay.
another thing that affects a psychological contract or another expectation that's built in is by, like I was saying, the kind of employer brand a company puts out there. So companies are now putting a lot of money into defining their career brands, right? So, for
Okay.
example, they'll have statements saying we're the best place to work, or there's more to life here, or the next gen of
Yeah.
this, etc. And when these companies come and pitch to university students, or even when you hear of their social media presence, you
Yeah.
expect that the internal culture would also be a reflection of it, right? Because you
True.
say that, okay, this is a
Have you
company
experienced
that
the
is.
same?
I have, so I go into every company with a lot of expectations. I'm somebody who enters with high
Right.
expectations. And I think
Okay.
it's a good thing for you to do. It's always good to always want the very best, I think.
Of
And then
course.
when you
Yeah.
don't have it, you work towards it in some way or the other. But at no
Mm.
point should you want less than the best from an organization, from an employer, right? I'll take an example of a company I've worked with in the past who really positioned themselves as this young, hip employer, right? And everybody would
Okay.
wear the same kind of casual clothes, and it was very
Ah.
fast, and they were all about how we are different and we are unique and we are special. And we're like, you're almost joining a old boys network. So your expectation going in is that, oh, this is a fast paced place and they're very data driven and they're very this. So you expect something very different, right? So in an organization like this, conversations about whether you're working from home or you're working in office are not relevant because they're very
Yeah.
data driven. So your expectation is different as opposed to if you were to join, I would say, a local company in any country, your expectations would be different. So in my
Yeah. Yeah.
contract, I think,
Definitely.
I'm going in and they look like they're a family run business. So they're not going to be
Okay.
very progressive about a few things, right?
Hmm.
So they're going to be a
Makes
little
sense.
bit more, there'll be less buffer to play with, etc. So I think your expectations are formed by those things as well. I think your expectations are also sometimes formed by the kind of culture you come from. So I come from a very collective culture, for example, right? And over the years, I've been in organizations who've had a collective culture, and I've been in organizations that have had a very individualistic culture. And going
Right.
in,
Okay.
my expectations have somehow remained the same as an employee because that's me sort of projecting and saying that no, I'm from a collective culture. I want to be taken care of by the organization. But organizations work separately. So expectations can be formed based on many things. So, your part of life you're in, the brand of the company, the employer brand of the company, how your school sets it up, and also how you want to experience your life. So it could be and that's where it's tricky, right? That when, for example, a company merges with another company, you see that the most obviously because the psychological contract was with the previous company. It wasn't with this new guy who's walked in. So there's a need for you to
Right.
reset that, which ends up disengaging a lot of employees as well.
Okay. So, although, I mean, it definitely depends on from organization
Yeah.
to organization. Have you seen the psychological, and being in HR, have you seen the psychological contract of employees or the unspoken
Yeah.
expectations from the employee side changing or evolving with time with you because I think that um were you working when the crisis had happened, the economy had collapsed in 2009? I don't
No,
no, I don't think so.
I was graduating the year it
Okay,
happened.
okay.
The
Oh, that
best
must
time
be
to
very
graduate.
is it? Isn't that the other way around? I mean,
No,
that was
I'm
what I was
being
assuming.
sarcastic. It's a
Yeah.
terrible time to graduate because the
Yeah.
Canary Wharf was a bloodbath. I remember I was in London at that time,
Um,
and
yeah,
there
yeah.
was nothing. There was literally nothing to stay on. Yeah. So I'll go
Mm,
back to your original questions. So I think there are three things that primarily I see have changed. I think the first thing is that we all accept and expect work from home, right? So
mm,
when I was starting my career out, there was a big HR idea around performance
mm,
over physical presence. Because a lot of companies were
mm.
struggling at implementing performance management systems and philosophies, and at that time the wave makers were saying no, physical presence, clock in at 9, clock out at 6 will not get you the same results as a performance
Yeah.
focused culture, right? But it was still
Right.
all talk. I remember somebody in my office was trying out a remote work situation. They were abusing those hours. So it was just not being set up for success. And I feel with
Mm.
COVID, we all realized two, three things. I think we all had a big existential crisis. That's one.
Yeah.
And we all
Yeah.
realized that there's actually work can be done from home, right? So there's still
Mm,
pockets of organizations which are like, no, but I think
mm,
now we expect to have, like any employee that I've spoken to in the last 2 years, I've specifically asked that, is there flexibility? Can I pick up and drop my
mm.
child? Do I get 2-3 days of work from home? Because all big employers are now trying to at least offer some kind of balance, right? What we expect in terms of flexibility, I think, has changed primarily. And
Right.
secondly, I think we've spoken so much about diversity, equity, and inclusion that perhaps I wouldn't say we are where we wanted to be in terms of progress, but I think
Okay.
it's it's something that's at an
Mm,
employee's forefront. Like I would hear people who would be long tenured in organizations I joined saying, this is the way it is here. They talk to us this way. This is the way it is
right.
here. But I think now we expect a certain level of respect at work and a certain level of inclusion. I'm not saying we're
Mm,
accorded that inclusion, but I think we've been
mm,
given the language to understand what is
mm.
exclusion and what is inequity and what is a lack of diversity. We notice it more. We discuss it in different language. It's felt more,
Right.
I think. So I think that's one
So,
thing.
how do you think that has come in the picture?
I think because of the increased focus on DEI, right? If you're a public listed company, you have these endless audits which require you to have certain kind of people and employee and labor
Right.
force processes, etc., in place. And diversity and inclusion has eventually slowly come into play there, saying that if you're this great a company, then this is a basic right for a lot of people in different societies, right? And I
Mm,
think that's how it's gotten a place at the table, and it's just
okay.
remained there because of that focus, and also the fact that it's a big part of your engagement initiatives now as well. So that's one thing, that conversation has started and people expect certain rights, even if they don't get it or even if they don't yet have the tools to work
Mm,
against any inequity. I think that's the second thing. And I think the
okay.
third thing I see changing is we don't, I think traditionally a lot of organizations have encouraged parental psychological contracts, right? That we are a family here, we'll take care of
Yeah.
each other. And I think that bubble has burst for employees in the last 20 years at least, with the amount of
Okay.
recessions we've hit, with how organizations have also, so many organizations have undertaken transformation journeys, right? Which has showed people that we are at the end of the day the masters of our own careers and our own
That is
lives.
true.
I think before that there was a greater expectation to be taken care of, and now perhaps I see, at least in my generation, or even in staff that's close to retirement, I see people understanding and taking charge of their own lives. So me before the company, I think, which is interesting, because you give the company more when you put yourself before the company.
Yeah. So, do you also think then, with the multi generational people in the
Mhm.
organization,
Yeah,
and Gen Z especially being at a point of when they joined, COVID
yeah,
had already hit,
yeah,
and they had gone through they have started their work in a flexible environment
yeah,
itself, and their expectation and the experiences are way
yeah.
different than earlier or pre-COVID people.
Hmm. Yeah,
So have you and they have been, growing up in the organization with that psychological contract that they are on their own, because I've heard of good companies
yeah,
which are flexible and working remotely. Even their healthcare benefits, it
yeah,
is taking them 6 months, a year to for them to avail those things.
yeah,
So do you think that with Gen Z coming in the picture,
yeah.
has the psychological contract been different for them than, because I believe you are a millennial yourself, would you think that it is different for a Gen Z than yourself when you join a company, and if the context is the same?
Yeah. I think that's a very solid question, because I think the answer is very, very complicated. So yes, you are right that if you look at a generation that started working post Corona, post COVID, they've not known any other way of work. They've only known this way of work. So their expectations are different. It's also, I think, much harder for them, because everybody can get better with, using the resources you have online today, whether it's Chat GPT or interview coaching skills.
Yeah.
We didn't have all of this. So I feel like the competition today is much, much tougher. And if I was to start out today, I would not get a job, if I were competing with all of them, because they've been honed so differently. They've been polished so differently. I see, these guys coming up and just being regular stars. You're picking out from such big
Okay.
some big pots of talent, I would say, right? So I think their training has been different and their competition is tougher. Their expectation from a workplace is perhaps closer to what I think my expectation from a workplace is, but I think it's eventually decided by where you are at life. So I see a lot of people in my family now, or other people that I connect with, that there's a fluidity between the entrepreneurship side and the corporate side. So people want to try their hands at both. It's not, you either do this or do that. So I do
Yeah.
think that one way in which perhaps people who've not experienced a workplace before Corona, they're braver is because they're able to leave more quickly. They're able to prioritize themselves more easily. Those are the two things. And I think they also expect perhaps a lesser amount of stability, but it could vary again from generation to generation, from place to place, and society to society as well.
So when you mentioned that they have a little more risk-taking ability to jump from one organization to another organization,
Yeah.
although I mean I do understand the drawbacks that the organization would face, but do you think that employees would also face any sort of drawback from jump hopping from one place to another?
Yeah, because I think, why do we hop, right? We hop because we're looking for a better manager, a better culture, somebody who can treat us better and see our potential. That's number one reason for hoping. Number two reason for hop, well, actually, not number one. I would say these
Yeah.
two reasons are both up there. So this is one. And the other
Yeah.
one is that we want to increase our benefit package, right? Because
Of course.
it's the easiest way to do this. So while that could happen, I think that that's good to have. You should try and hop and get more experience. Um, I think the downside of that is, and I would still go back to a conversation I was having with a recruiter around a few months back, where they said, why have you hopped? This is now your fourth company. So why have you hopped? So I think that bias is still there, right? And I
Yeah.
said, I hopped because life happened, right? Like there was a layoff here, and then I had to take a sabbatical for my parents and my son. So different things happened, right? But there's still, I think sometimes the decision makers at executive levels are still people who started working 30 years ago. So their
Yeah.
definition of what commitment looks like, their definition of what loyalty looks like, engagement with the company looks like is still a little bit different from, let's say, of people who've just started working 10 years ago. So that could be one, I would say, disadvantage, that you could be seen as a hopper. But I do hope and believe that there are leaders out there who rise above that and say, no, you know what, it's okay. We don't all need a uniform or can build a uniform CV because our benefit is
Yeah.
different, our privilege is different. So that could be one thing. And I think the other thing
Right.
could be that you could quickly burn out. So, just the idea that if you experience a bad culture after a bad culture, lack of, let's say, support after a lack of support, you can very easily or more easily become disenchanted with a place. Because the
Yeah.
smaller you spend at a place, the smaller support network you have at that place, which also becomes your wider support network in your wider professional space, right? So I think that could be the other thing, that if you're not building strong enough relationships at a workplace before you leave it, you could professionally burn out and not have that network to sort of hold on to when you're in a difficult time in your career or want to make a transition.
Yeah. And when you mentioned about, people who are hiring or on the leadership position have experience or have the expectation that 10 years, 20 years in the workplace, that is
Yeah.
what I have done and I have been expecting.
Yeah.
And you come as a company organization hopper. So do you not see a generational gap there? And as an HR,
Yeah.
how do you make sure that that generational gap does not become a challenge?
You see, one thing that all HR departments usually do is to say that, hey, we have competency based hiring, right? You have competency based hiring, and the next thing you do is that you train everybody on bias disruption and what looks like a
Yeah.
question that is loaded with bias, what kind of an opinion or feedback looks like it's coming from a place of bias. So we do those two things. But there's also this, that HR's role is to educate and disrupt and guide towards the best practice. But there are many a times in which, if your HR team is not set up to be a strategic partner, you will not have much of a say in that decision. You can't disrupt that bias, which is why, one thing I remember Shazad Umar again saying, the guy I feel like I learned everything from, is that we have to be so employee centric that the business thinks of us as having an equal role at the table, right? Which is the biggest struggle of an HR department. Because if HR is not seen as that, HR cannot disrupt any of these decisions. HR cannot even get into a space where they can have or engage a leader in a conversation and be like, do you think that's coming from a place of bias more than a place of competency based selection? Right. So I think
Okay.
the space to do that is limited based on what is your partnership with business like. There's also this, right, that as we become more and more senior, we also become really good at hiding our own biases. So we can justify our own biases in many ways. So I think,
Yeah.
yes, we have enough processes in place to educate people around this and to be able to disrupt this. But does that happen 100% of the time? I don't think so.
And when you talk about employees or organizations
Yeah.
being employee centric, so have you noticed the power dynamics of
Yeah.
these psychological contracts shifted with the employees not having more say? Or would you agree on that a different age group has a role to play in that?
I would stay away from giving a blanket answer. And I take the example of two people in particular that I've spoken to over the last 2 months, right? there is somebody who's at a stage where they need financial stability, but they're not experiencing the kind of growth they want to experience at work. However, for the sake of financial stability for the next 2-3 years, they're willing to stay on with their current organization. But in 2-3 years' time, when we have that stability, when they have that stability, they'd still be
Yeah.
looking to move if things don't change. That's one. There's somebody else, however, who just, let's say, starting out their career or who are already a VP at a company, and this is their
Okay.
third or fifth company. They have a stellar CV. They have a generalist CV. They're in a skill pool where they can hop more often, which is true for HR as well. In HR, we can become generalists quite easily, and there are more jobs
Yeah.
available than, let's say, that of a technical engineer in a specific specialized industry at some point.
Right.
They might be looking to hop, and they might have opportunities to hop as well, which gives them more power in that contract because they don't have any personal responsibilities bogging them down or tying them
Okay.
down to this specific company. So I think your power in the psychological contract, one is what your mindset is as a person, right? How much agency do you think you have in building your own career? That, I'm not getting the growth I need here. Do I stay on or am I going to go? That's one. It's
Yeah.
also on how generalist your skill set or how overly specialized your skill set is. That is it a skill set where you can go and apply to a lot of jobs, so there are a lot of
Right.
opportunities? Is it
Right.
overly specialized to a level where only one or two roles come up every year, right? And thirdly, if you think right now you have the power in your own personal life to walk away, right? Or even to have
Okay.
conversations or network in the organization where you can have these critical conversations and say, what's going on? I don't want this, or I want
Right.
this to change. So I think it depends on
Right.
those three things. One easy way to think of it is in this way that in South Asian societies, gap year is seen as the year of death. It's very difficult.
Yeah.
I think we've spoken
Yeah.
about this. It's very difficult in your head, in your parents' head, in society's head for you to recover from a gap year.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
other
It's like, what were
societies,
you
it's
doing?
yeah. Why were you being a burden to earth? But in other societies, it's seen as something that's normal and that you need to take from time to time. So it gives those people a different kind of mental agency as well, right? What can I take? What can I not take? And I would go back to when I left my workplace. I've left two workplaces out of my own decision so far. Actually, it's been the same workplace I've left twice so far. I just realized. And I
All
remember the
right.
first time I was leaving it, it was a very, very hard decision. They didn't have anything in place which would let me be away from work, go back and help with my parents, rehabilitation for more than 2 months. I needed a 2-3 months leave
Oh,
at that time. They didn't have that
okay.
in place. And I felt like, everyone I talked to would tell me, you actually don't have the agency to resign because it'll be the end of your career. How would you tell people you left,
Okay.
right? And at that time, I'd worked
Yeah.
through having a baby and everything. And I remember feeling I didn't have agency at all. I remember feeling weighed
Okay.
down by this decision and thinking, I'm going to be one of those people who just left behind, who will not grow, and I couldn't do it right. So I felt I had less agency in life because of where I was mentally and who I was as a
Right.
person at that time. But once I'd already done that and I
Hmm.
rejoined the workforce within a 6 month gap, after a 6 months gap, I rejoined and I remember the second time I felt this is not what I want to do. I need a change of specialty. I need a change of company, a change of career. It was a much easier
Right.
decision.
I think definitely it is about the individual and how you mentioned that their agency changed with time and with experience.
Yeah.
I think it's even the organizations that, even I
Yeah.
have been with. There have been people who definitely ask for that, why have you been hopping, or why do you have a gap in your
Yeah.
CV? But then now things have been changing a bit more, that people understand if you have a reason for it.
Yeah.
And I have seen my friends who have been in the workplace since 10 years or something. They take sabbatical to just travel the world, and
Yeah.
that's about it. And companies actually, I would say the innovative companies see that
Yeah.
as an asset, because now the person would be more the person is more having more open mind, is more
Hmm.
global, it has more understanding as an individual. So
Yeah.
things are very, very gradually changing, but I think they are.
No, you're right. I think it's we are getting used to the idea of non-traditional CVs or career paths. I think that is true. I think one thing that does remain constant is that companies need people who can commit for longer. I think that remains constant because yes, there are people who've had to quit and change because of circumstance, but there's also that portion of the workplace which is just easy quitting, right? Like they, when the tough gets going or whatever that's called, you
Yeah,
quit
yeah.
easily. So I think organizations just want to avoid hiring people who can not offer the kind of commitment they need.
Now that we are talking about employees being for a longer tenure, how do you
Mhm.
think that employee retention has been a challenge for the companies? And again, considering the generational expectations from the company,
Yeah.
and how, in your idea, can it be
Mm.
better?
So interestingly, all the companies that I've been with have never had a retention problem. Because when we talk about
Okay.
retention, people put in an easier KPI saying retaining this much percentage of the population. But
Yeah.
I think it's retaining the top talent that's the problem, right? How do we retain top talent, diverse talent, and give them the timely opportunities or engagement needed, which makes them feel like we are investing in them? Two things very important for retention is people seeing that you are investing in people and letting them be better than their worst days at work, right? That's one.
Right.
So that
Okay.
feeling of that nurturing feeling of, oh, it's, I can grow, I can fix this. So you're always sort of engaged in a cycle of future focused initiatives or actions. That's one. And I think the other is sponsoring careers that need to be sponsored to retain your top staff.
With your experience, what do you think is that you have experienced is the most maybe unique or a disaster story that you have experienced with culture or psychological contract, which has been either, if it's unique, it's
Hmm.
surprisingly effective, or if it was a disaster story that with an
Yeah.
unfortunate outcome? Can you think of any such experience?
So I've experienced two, three waves of layoffs at my respective employers, right? And one thing I remember very gravely is that I was with this organization where a big chunk of my team was laid off. And I think one thing I never forget is that the day they received the news, our manager didn't contact them. They didn't hear from this manager for the next few days because in the manager's
Okay.
head, they were like, I'm just going to give you space, you know what, and then contact you.
Ah,
Because people also operate from a place of fear, right? So
yeah,
it's not
yeah.
listed anywhere in an HR policy that do not contact the people who've been laid off, please.
Yeah,
No
because
HR
because
policy
I
dictates this. Yeah.
of course, because I think
Yeah.
people getting laid off would want to talk to their managers or
Absolutely. Because
whosoever
I
the
think
supervisor is.
when you're laid off, and especially if you're a good worker, right? If you're somebody who's used to being a top performer, your own self worth is challenged. You know, what did I do wrong?
Yeah,
Did they
yeah.
not need me at all? Was I this dispensable? And the week after the layoff, I spent a lot of time talking to these people, right? And I realized that I don't ever want to work with people who will not call me if I get laid off. I want to
Oh
work with
my.
teams who consider me valuable enough to reach out to me, right? It's that's one thing I experienced. And luckily for me, when the Amazon layoffs happened, I remember this very specifically, that the thing that made it easier and more manageable was that my manager called me right away. Her name is Susanna King. She still works at Amazon. She called us right away and she said, you know, I can show up wherever you guys are. If you want to have a coffee, if you want to understand how this works, I'm right here. If you don't want to meet, that's fine. I want you to
Yeah.
know that I'm here. I'm willing to hold space, hold emotions, and offer any kind of support. And I thought that was, it's something I would never forget. It's, I don't think
Yeah.
all leaders are able to offer that amount of courage in the face of uncertainty as well, right? So it's, I
Yeah,
would say
yeah.
the first one is a disastrous one, and the second one is where I've seen that skill being used really well by a leader.
Yeah, because
Yeah.
as a leader, especially in the current era, empathy is the most important skill or
Yeah.
trait that one leader can have. Well, we are towards the end of our podcast,
Yeah.
and my last question would be, given the pace of which things are changing, where do you see the future of psychological contracts heading? And
Hmm.
would it be again contextual, or would
Yeah.
it be generational based, or would it be regional based? How
Yeah.
do you think that how do you see it changing?
Um, slowly I do see employees gaining more power in that contract because so many different
Mm,
industries are opening up. Career mobility has become a little bit easier. So you can now actually
yeah.
go and get a job in something you don't have experience in more than before, right? So I do see people walking in with more agency into those contracts, knowing that, oh, this is what
Mhm.
works for me. Because we have so many
Yeah.
opportunities to educate ourselves around that, Google these things or read articles or see podcasts, which can inform the way we approach work and grow ourselves as people. That's one. I also see people walking in with more realistic expectations. I feel like when I walked into the
Mm.
marketplace, looking at PwC or this and that and P&G and Coke and you expected the Oscars, right?
Mm.
And that's not
Of
what
course.
work life is. Work life is, unfortunately. So I think people are probably walking in with more realistic contracts than before and more realistic
Mm.
expectations because Glassdoor networks are able
Mhm.
to give that information more easily, how the internal and the external brand of the culture is different in an organization. So those are the two things I see.
Mm.
And the third thing I
Okay.
see is that people will now, perhaps, hopefully, inshallah, if AI does not disrupt
Mm.
all possible jobs, is that
Yeah.
people would have their first contract with themselves. And I hope everybody can
Mm.
do that. It's something that I've only recently started doing, which is to say, what
Okay.
do you think you need and
Okay.
deserve? What do you want? At the end of
Ah.
20, 30 years, what would make you happy? And what can give
Right.
you the safety net to take those decisions?
Mm.
So maybe that's the third change that I hope a lot of
Mm.
people can
That's
implement for
that's
themselves.
amazing that you mentioned that, you know, a contract with the individual, with yourself, because if you yourself do not know where do you see yourself, or what do you
Yeah.
expect out of yourself, and how do you want to grow,
Yeah.
I think it's not just about the psychological contract with the organization, but you yourself won't be able to reach anywhere and
No.
would be dissatisfied with whatever is coming, or even the opportunities that are coming your way.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So I think that's a bang on way to end this conversation. Thank you so much, Kiran, for a wonderful conversation, a very eye-opening conversation where I learned so much, and I'm pretty sure the listeners would learn so much, so many things from you.
No, thank you, Kritika, for having me. And I hope we can continue having these conversations. I think it's important, especially as HR professionals, because we might not think
Mm.
so, and other departments might not think so, but we do
Okay.
impact employee life in a big way with what we do, how we show up. So I think it's important to have these conversations. And I really appreciate your time today.
Definitely. So I
Yeah.
think part two, part three, part four are in on their way then.
Yeah.
Don't forget to follow and share the podcast so that you never miss an episode. Leave us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. Your reviews help us to reach out to more listeners and continue to bring the latest insights from the field of business psychology. Thank you for joining us on this journey. This is your host, Kritika Kashyap, signing off. Stay curious, my friends.